Paul Ebenkamp is the author of The Louder the Room, The Darker the Screen. And by the way, you have some great titles. So that was published in 2015. Parallel Realism, another good title, published in 2017. And Late Hiss, I like that one as well. He co-hosts the Woolsey Heights reading series periodically from his home in Berkeley. He occasionally releases music as well under the name Position. And now, Regular Acid Consciousness, a Xeroxed long serial poem published on a clipboard, is forthcoming. Is that still forthcoming?
No, I got that done.
Okay. Oh, perfect. Beautiful.
I'll send you
That's
one.
fun. Yeah, that would be great. That sounds fun. And then the bottom right corner of all things, another great title, a PDF of visual art. What kind of visual art?
I dabble.
Okay.
A lot of screen prints is something I like to do, and usually that incorporates writing in some way, posters and such. And a few of those screen prints are more abstract, and a lot of layering, a lot of scattered work that will be around in my environment for a while, and then I'll add another layer later on and just slowly accrete this sort of stuff. It's not a regular practice at all.
Okay.
But over a decade or so, one has a way of amassing some stuff that's actually okay. But yeah, it's really not my wheelhouse very much, but I do love the screen printing, and I love painting and drawing.
Excellent. Well, welcome to the podcast, and thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, you bet.
So, for a good while, whenever I would do this podcast, I would start with a question from an old Zen koan, and I thought, why not do that again? So I'm going to ask you this question. We'll see what you have to say about it. The question is, all things return to the one. Where does the one return to? So what do you think? Where does the one return to?
I think the return. It returns to the return.
Ooh, I like that.
The one is kind of the bright, clearly outlined thing that is delineated and known, and that's not the way, that's not the Tao. Like the Tao is the darkness that can't be seen, that can only be, I guess, pointed at in a kind of, like, the phenomenology of it is, there's less definition, there's less certainty about this is my thing and it works and here's how it works. We don't really get that. Like, that's a luxury we don't get, especially as a poet or an artist. We don't get that. It's an illusion, and it's a helpful illusion because it points out what's around it, which is the sense of, I guess, for me, the most useful word for it is the Heraclitus, the flux, and that's contemporaneous with the Buddhist thinking that,
sure, of course,
that koan is coming from. So yeah, it returns to the returning. There's not one thing called the return, but there is the returning is always
returns to the returning. I love that. That's super cool. Yeah, you've already said a few things that have triggered other questions. I will say that, I mean, I love Taoism, and so I the Tao Te Ching is one of my probably my favorite, like, spiritual texts, maybe. But my impression of the Tao, so to speak, is not that it's necessarily just the darkness, or I guess the yin side of things, but that it's both the yin and the yang perhaps. And so it's hard for me. It's kind of, yeah, the totality instead
Hmm.
of, it's like, what is seen and what is unseen, I guess.
Hmm. Um, yeah, I love when I fell in love with this sort of philosophy way of thinking, I'm so drawn to the way that the discourse is sort of self-dissolving.
Hmm.
Um, it's the Dharma being, whatever we can say about it, it is already that,
Right.
and its opposite, and we have this binary kind of way of thinking because it's been a
Yeah.
part of our survival. But yeah, this really stretches the sense that something is one thing or it's another.
Hmm.
I think it's in the Zen tradition, the idea of not one and not two.
Yeah. Yeah.
And a lot of that is just amazingly fucked up. Like it's just like,
Yeah.
what the fuck you gonna do? Tough. It's not
Right.
one and it's not two.
Right.
Sit with that. And that, yeah, it's very challenging. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. I know. And it's, yeah, it's challenging and it's difficult and frustrating, but then simultaneously, the Zen tradition and koans and stuff are also very, it's just so simple and so direct, or what it's trying to point to is so simple and so direct that it's almost like the kind of the paradoxical puzzle of it all seems to actually be trying to point to how simple and direct it is, if that makes
Yeah.
sense. So it's, again, it's kind of like this bothness happening at the same time.
Yeah.
um yeah, and so another a couple other things that you mentioned that I wanted to highlight. Well, you said the whole one has a way of, when you were talking about an individual person, one has a way of amassing things, especially uh you know artist or writer or whatever. And that reminded me of something I've been thinking about a lot. I tend to amass things as well, whether it's books or documents or um drafts or whatever, and but I also am really interested in like alchemizing the things that I amass. And it seems like that's kind of what you, when you were describing your visual art stuff, it's almost a process of alchemy in a certain way.
Mm.
And um I've been really interested in this idea and also trying to practice this thing that I've been calling like pruning. It started when I was getting ready to move from LA to Columbia a few months ago, and I had to prune my possessions and my books and my notebooks and all sorts of stuff. And so I was having to use discernment to figure out what I felt like was the most important and necessary stuff to keep around and what could I discard, um and all that. So I guess I'm curious, maybe, do you think about your creative practice or your personal practice in the within the frame of like alchemy or pruning on any level?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, let me think for a second.
Sure, of course. Take your time.
There is always a surfeit. There's always a kind of a too muchness. I could always one of my jokes. So I write in a journal every day. It's a very simple thing. It's
Me too.
by freehand, and I'm kind of improvising. And I've been doing this every morning, with the exception of maybe 5 days a year for about a decade, and it's a little or it's a lot, and it's just the force of habit. I joke that I do this every day so that I don't have to deal with what I wrote yesterday.
Mm,
That's the terrible option, is like, oh no, I don't want to actually deal with what I've been, the raw material, because that's a little more difficult.
yeah.
So I'd rather just plow forward and just create more stuff, like my inner capitalist. It's like, let's just create, expand.
Right.
Um, so there's always this overmuchness, this overflow. And it's kind of like, when I think of alchemy, I do think of a kind of pruning, that
Hmm.
the philosophical tree is such an image of, like the classical sort of discipline of alchemy, the
Like
taking of
refining.
elements at the right time from a certain source, pruning at the right time, um, uh, shaping a process of growth, whether that's organic growth or, the alchemical kind of, um, symbolic process.
Hmm.
So absolutely, it is, an alchemy in the sense that I'll try something out in a certain context, and it'll sit there and kind of, I'm trying to think of it'll kind of compost there for a while. It'll seep in, and it either works, or that place where I put it basically rejects it. And I take it somewhere else to put it in another format. Since I have a couple different writing formats that I use,
Hmm.
um, because writing just normative typeset poems, which I do, and I'm working on currently on a manuscript of considerable length.
Mm.
That's not going to catch everything, So I have the screen prints, I have a couple of visual projects, the regular acid consciousness, which is freehand with a Sharpie. So all of these things are kind of scumbled in their like substratum of the pure language of it,
Hmm.
and then growing up into these different forms, and then they die and then they get sucked up into something else. It's a beautiful way of thinking about it when I think about it that way, as a
Yeah.
sort of organic process, because whether or not I get this book published in the kind of perfect bound great way with the French flap that I care about and some reputable press, these are really such cultural things that I have little control over, and I'm not really that in touch with, but I am in
Right.
touch with the process of creation and watching the weird turns that things take. And when, you do the alchemical process at the wrong kind of time of day, it peters out, and that's that's part of the difficulty and the gift as well of living a more elemental life, I think. That's
Hmm.
really the goal, and having a nice book published, which I have been very lucky to have had that happen to me for really no fault of my own. It's just, again, stuff I feel like I have such little direct control over. I'm terrible at promoting my own work.
Me too.
I am very allergic to all of these perfectly smart and decent things to
Yeah.
do to support yourself. It's like,
Exactly.
no, I'm not gonna.
Exactly.
So yeah, it's close to the knives kind of thing, with the alchemical process of yeah, being close to the elements,
Yeah.
um, without getting too spaced out about it. That is just the Tao
Yeah.
of it. That's the kind of union with, um, uh, the life energy, I guess.
Yeah. Oh man. Yeah. It seems like we have a lot in common. It sounds like you have a certain part of you that is a maximalist, like you create, not only or do you write in the journal every day, which I do the same thing, but you also kind of create in different mediums, and it's so it seems like you're a maximalist in that way. But just judging on your personality and stuff, it seems like you have a side that's maybe values minimalism to a certain extent as well. So kind of the balance between those can be fun to explore. I feel like you mentioned return, or well, with the Zen question that I asked you about, where does the one return to, and you said the one returns to kind of returning, or the act of returning. And the idea of returning is another thing, just like pruning, that I've been thinking about a lot, because returning, that notion pops up in so many different ways. It's like I think about it with the hero's journey, which I've been thinking about for a long time, the retreat and the return. And then that, the Zen question is one example of it. And with pruning and kind of meaning making lately, on a personal level and on the creative level, which of course those two fuse together, but it's like when I'm trying to figure out what to preserve or transform or discard in my life, I'm looking at the stuff that I return to. So when I was looking at all my books in LA, trying to figure out which ones I was going to keep or get rid of, I was really kind of, the main question is like, which books have I returned to the most? Which books do I plan to return to in the future? Because I'm not going to really keep books around unless I'm going to return to them in some way. So I've been thinking about the meaning making process of my own life as very much revolving around the act of returning. It's like the things that we return to most, whether habits, people, patterns, writers, music, whatever, the things we return to, those are the things that are most meaningful in our life. That's not necessarily positive or negative. And a lot of times the things that we return to, especially patterns and habits, are largely subconscious or unconscious or whatever. So I guess this is a long way of just saying that, that alchemical process or the pruning process, creatively or just on a personal level, is very much, it revolves around returning. And I think that in my own life, I've been trying to be a little bit more conscious about what I return to. And so, for example, like with my with music, like my music library on my phone, I've been returning to all of these playlists that I've made in the last like 15 years, and I've been pruning them. um and it's been fun, and it's just, I've really found a lot of, it's been very energizing to kind of be more conscious about what I return to, I guess. And I think I'm trying to do the same thing with like poetry and stuff, returning to old drafts and I think being a little bit more, I don't know, I've been a little bit more discerning about what I'm keeping around, I guess. Whereas in the past, I was more kind of maximalist, and it's just like, I'm gonna keep everything,
Yeah.
So do you relate with any of that?
Yeah. Yeah. I think about the architecture of where I've lived. I have this relatively small room, and I have pretensions to 3 art practices, and it's not possible to do 3 things that take equipment in a small room,
Right.
despite the largish house. So that's definitely contoured what I what I keep and what I've tried to make what I keep and what I need a little closer together. Like in terms, I
Nice.
want what I keep and what I need to be more of a to overlap a little more precisely.
It's a good way to put
Um,
it.
yeah. So, and the books, my God, the books. And I've I was thinking about architecture. I've lived in the same house for 14 years with countless housemates that, you know, when they move out, they take the good stuff and they leave the stuff they don't want. And I'm not particularly mindful of, I'm as good at neglecting my personal space as anybody.
Sure.
So my mode of cleaning in the last few years has kind of developed into, picture someone on their knees throwing things over their shoulder to get them out of space. That's like, I've come to really love a certain, and it applies to writing too, a certain sort of recklessness or a sort of devil may care. Like
Mm,
I'm cutting something from a poem that's been there for forever that I thought was so precious, and I'm just like, screw it,
yeah.
don't need it, forget it. Like,
Yep.
thanks, I guess, bye.
Right.
Having that sort of cold-heartedness about um,
Hmm.
how these books obviously being objects and poems also developing the properties of objects to their detriment, they become furniture. And
Mm,
I've found that I've been working on the same manuscript for 6 years and it's been
mm,
rejected a lot. And I think that's absolutely right, because it's helped me see how much of it really was waiting to be pruned and waiting to
mm,
be just not necessarily doing the Marie Kondo thing where you're like, thank you so much for all that you did,
right.
but it's a little bit of that. It's like, good job, bye, like, you done good, now cut it out.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh yeah.
So
Yeah, I know that.
yeah,
I know that feeling in poems. Like sometimes I have just reread that poem so much and I've become attached to a certain line or whatever. And but then, I can get to the point where I realize that that line does not need to be there anymore. And it feels really good to cut it out sometimes. So yeah, maybe there is a certain, well, lack of sentimentality is important, I guess, sometimes with the creative process.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
well, I primarily became familiar with your stuff just on Instagram. I'm sure we had writer friends in common and all that. And there was a period in my life where I just kind of friended and followed a lot of creative people and writers on social media. Um, and anyways, I've been seeing your handwritten poems on Instagram for at least a couple of years, and I always really liked them. And so that's mainly why I reached out to you. Um, so I guess I'm curious a little, curious about hearing more about your background, like, what was it, what are some of the factors that led you to want to be a writer, and what specifically sparked this project, which I guess is the regular acid consciousness project.
Yeah, yeah. I I learned to read pretty early. The Berenstein Bear books did it, and these free pizzas that you'd get like they had a you read so many books, you get a free little pan pizza from Pizza Hut.
Nice.
This was the Red Bridge Pizza Hut in Kansas City, Missouri.
Okay.
So I was reading before kindergarten, and then in first grade I read Sphere by Michael Crichton, which I didn't really understand a word of. I learned much later that everybody else doesn't understand it either. I thought I was just like tripping out, but the
Uh-huh.
feeling was unmistakable. This just incredible uh, power. I think the sort of psychedelic, for lack of a better word, sort of psychedelic, expansive um, powers of a voice coming to you in your head from another consciousness. This was incredibly powerful, and so that's where it started. I was writing poetry in middle school and writing in a journal, so I've kept that practice. And in college, I
Uh,
had some great teachers. My teacher was Graham Faust.
oh,
Um,
Graham Faust, yeah, I like his stuff.
yeah, and we're still close, and I've followed his uh, work with great interest, and he was a really powerful encouragement at a
Nice.
really key time. So a little bit of encouragement at the right time does a lot.
Absolutely.
So I would say that, plus my love of reading, plus my love of writing, with a good teacher's encouragement, that really pushed me on my way and made me confident enough to be ambitious with the work.
Hmm.
I moved out here for graduate school. I got an MFA at St. Mary's College, so I studied there with him. He had moved there from Iowa, and Brenda Hillman. And
Nice.
so those are my two teachers, and I couldn't
That's
ask
excellent.
for two better teachers. The very, very powerful poets and teachers. So I had been writing, and I had known that I didn't have a career in mind. I've never been particularly moved to a certain line of work. That is until relatively recently, but I've always known I wanted to commit a fair amount of my life to art and to writing. Got the MFA, was here in the Bay Area 15 years ago, relatively young person. And anybody who moves to a new city that has a very active art scene, and of course a competitive art scene, and a confusing one, that's difficult. That's hard
Oh
to
yeah.
keep your head above water. So anybody who's hearing or seeing us, yeah, it can get better. You just need I think, yeah, a bit of fuck itness, like just
Mm-hmm.
I'm just gonna do this, who cares? And but it is difficult. So that actually led to wanting to write literally with a big marker on a big piece of paper. The energy there really was, I don't feel heard. I am really struggling to make sense of, how to kind of in a really pretty egotistical way. It's like I want to be heard.
Mm-hmm.
So I just literally went big.
Right.
It's very kind of
All
crude.
caps usually,
Like,
right?
yeah, it's just like it couldn't be more less subtle of a.
Right.
But yeah, I had a job where I didn't have much time in the space of a day, but it was an office job, and I did have access to paper and markers and a scanner and Photoshop. So that's where I got involved, really interested with interstitial sorts of times and places for writing, getting a lot of sort of contact time out of a little bit of space and time, and then just set it aside. And so that's when I discovered that I really loved writing with a fine tip black Sharpie. And I had a period of time where I filled an entire book with the deliberate aim of changing my handwriting in a couple of different ways. So I had this weird, like, year-long experience of getting in really deep with a certain way of writing, like physical handwriting.
Mm-hmm.
And then, yeah, things kind of went from there. Um, the best example recently was I worked this totally dead-end job at a restaurant nearby that closed after a year, and we would write on meal tickets with a fine tip black Sharpie the order of the person. So I suddenly had access to countless of these little pieces of paper
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and a lot of downtime, and would just have this process of this interstitial moments here and there where I could just out of the top of my head, and that became a series. That became a long poem called The Dead End That Just Wouldn't Die, which I
Nice.
braided into a manuscript, and that's been really fulfilling to have that project. So it's my kind of weapon, the fine tip black Sharpie, but it
Oh,
could be
that's beautiful.
anything.
I love it.
It's yeah. So
And
that's what
so
keeps
most of
writing
those
alive
those
for me.
black tipped poems are kind of improvisational, like kind of
They were at first.
automatic-ish.
They were at first, but I took them home and worked them over endlessly. I mean, it's a series of about 35 right now, and I
Okay.
kind of feel like an accomplished performing musician, which I'm not, but in the sense that I really have to warm up. So
Mm-hmm.
for each one of these, there's probably 10 or 20 of the identical ones where I'm just doing the hand
Okay.
script and like getting into the flow of what it's going to actually be, until it gets to this point of a sort of not deliberate sort of just transmission of energy. So
Mm-hmm.
it kind of gets away from the intentional nature of having to sit down and doing something very intentionally to a freer place.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, they've been heavily worked over, obsessively, I think, worked over, and
Nice.
but preserving a feeling of improvisation, that's really
Yeah.
important.
Yeah. I totally know what you mean. I try to do the same thing with my poetry. The first kind of the first impulse and the first drafts come from a very um intuitive and improvisational place, and then but I also love editing. I want to prune it down to its best form. That's so
Yeah.
the balance between heavy editing and heavy improv is
Yeah,
the right balance for me.
totally.
Um, yeah, that's cool. That's really cool. I would I'm looking forward to I mean, seeing more of the stuff you put on social media, but then I guess seeing the final project as well. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. The great goal.
yeah, yeah. Well, I saw that you've done a couple things with Robert Haas as well, right?
Yeah.
And so I wanted to tell you that, like, well, number one, you said you've lived in that house for 14 years on Woolsey. I moved in to a basement in a old house on Woolsey in 2010, which is very, I guess, short, like the year after maybe you moved into that house ish.
Hmm.
So that's
Yeah.
a crazy overlap. I only lived there for about a year and a half, and then I moved to the San Francisco side. But um, so I wanted to bring that up. But when I lived in Berkeley, at that time, I had read a lot of Robert Haas's poetry, and I knew that he worked at UC Berkeley, and I reached out to him on email, and I asked him if I could come into like his office hours. I wasn't a student there, but I wanted to just come talk to him. So I asked him if it would be all right if I came to his office just to like talk to him about poetry and stuff. And he was super nice, and he was like, "Yeah, sure," And so I went in and talked to him in his office for a little bit. We talked about poetry, we talked about Buddhism, and talked about Gnosticism and stuff. And then, we were like pretty caught up having a good conversation. He was like, "Well, I need to walk around campus and get some coffee, but come with me, and I'll buy you a coffee and stuff." So we walked
Mm.
around campus and drank coffee together and stuff. So that was fun. He's a really nice guy. But that was the only time I directly interacted with him. But I saw that you guys worked on at least two things together, and I'm specifically interested in the selected poems. I guess it was mainly Song of Myself and some of Walt Whitman's other poetry, and then you guys did like some sort of commentary or whatever. But I want
Yeah.
to know more about that. But Walt Whitman is one of my favorite poets, so I was just I was very interested in that. So tell me a little bit about how, that process in that book.
Yeah. Yeah. That was a beautiful project. So it's a book that's out from Counterpoint Press here in Berkeley, and it's designed for basically a casual reader, or maybe more specifically classroom use, like on the undergraduate level, to introduce people. Um, so it has both the uh, youngest and oldest versions of Song of Myself. He
Awesome.
made substantive changes
Yeah.
well into his old age.
Yeah.
Um, I could say more about that, but just suffice to say, I prefer the first one.
Ah,
Um, and then we did a lexicon, really, because he was such a lexical poet. His vocabulary was so strange and heterogeneous and mixed from all kinds of disciplines like journalism,
mm-hmm.
engineering, religion, architecture, ship, seafaring, and just countless. And he had these weird usages that appeared to be 19th century slang.
Mm-hmm.
So what we did was look up a lot of these words. Whenever possible, we used the dictionaries that he would have used at the New York, the ones at the New York Public Library in 1860,
Cool.
or earlier, sorry. And so
Mm-hmm.
we went through that and amassed a huge list and pruned that down to have just something that could actually be read independently of the poem. That
Hmm.
you could actually just read this lexicon as its own text, and it would be entertaining and
That's
weird.
awesome. Yeah.
So yeah, it was great. I can't believe we endeavored to do this. About halfway through it, we were just like, we are so screwed.
Uh-huh. Yeah, that's a lot.
Yeah.
When did you guys put that out?
I want to say 2012,
Oh, okay. So it was a
20,
while ago.
2013, maybe something like that.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, can you say anything? Well, I want to, Walt Whitman has remained one of my favorite poets for many years, and um, every maybe once a year or every couple of years at least, I return to his poetry, especially Song of Myself. That's one of my favorite poems of all time. Um, well, since you kind of became, you know, intimately familiar with the different versions of it, and I've always been fascinated how he continued to transform Leaves of Grass and Song of Myself for, throughout for decades until he was on his deathbed,
Mhm.
basically, I guess. Why is it that you prefer the earlier version over the later? I'm just curious.
Yeah, the later, a lot of it is admittedly, kind of cosmetic. But I guess I recently learned that the root of cosmetic is cosmos. That
Mm.
the Greek cosmos means beauty. So the cosmos of what makes the poem beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
The early version is, uh, well, in the later version, it's parceled out into many different numbered sections.
Mm-hmm.
There is this neatness of finish to it that is, um, kind of deflates a lot of the forward momentum of the long song. It reduces the aspect of it being a song
Mm.
to me. Numbering it into countless sections, that's not a song, and
Mm-hmm.
he correctly titled the poem the first time that it is a beautiful song of myself.
Yeah.
And the self in his conception is definitely a cosmos. It's
True.
takes in everything, and so it's a poem without a center. I almost want to say it's a poem without a beginning and an end.
Yeah.
Uh, and it's uh, um, a lot of the extremely weird word choices and formulations were, I think of it as a form of self-censorship. Like, oh, I
Mm.
was too weird back then. Let's make it a little
Uh,
more understandable.
right.
And there is lastly, um, a lot of cleaning up of the
Mm.
queerness.
Mm.
A lot of really just like pronoun substitution and
Uh,
other things that it's very interesting. That's why we printed them both together.
mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, give me the lightning in the bottle,
Mm-hmm.
rather than the the sort of summa lyrica, of someone's mature work. But
Right.
we take both, and it's such an amazing thing that he did
Yeah.
is making that poem
Yeah.
truly the song of his life.
Yeah. Yeah. I have always been interested in how, like, in the early 1850s, when, you know, um, I guess Walt Whitman went to um New Orleans for some sort of journalist assignment, and spent time there, and as far as I can tell, when he came back from that trip is when he started taking these long walks and started writing Song of Myself in like the early 1850s, I think. And
Mm.
um, I saw some of his I think he wrote some novels before that, and of course he was writing journalism, but all the writing that I saw before his time when he returned from New Orleans, um, his style and the vitality of his writing completely changed, and it seemed like he had a very I've read like different theories about what transformative experience happened for him down in Louisiana. I
Mm.
know part of it was just kind of seeing a diverse group of people down there, and kind of yeah, encountering different kinds of people that maybe he had not before, and kind of um so yeah, that transformation that he went through in his personal life and in his writing at the time is fascinating.
I know that I'd be interested to square when that trip was with his account of reading Emerson,
Yeah.
because he said that when he had been, the words he used were, I was simmering, 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 and then I read Emerson and I completely boiled over.
I remember reading that. Yeah, I love that. I love that. You know, that's incredible. Yeah, that is interesting. I wonder how those two things line up, because I know Emerson definitely kind of liberated his mind and soul, I guess, in a lot of ways, as Emerson kind of did the same for me as well. I remember
Mhm.
I took a transcendentalist, well, no, it's called American Romanticism, when I was an undergrad. And yeah, you know, reading Emerson and Whitman and Thoreau and Emily Dickinson in that class, but especially Emerson and Whitman, um, completely did something to me, that it was perfect timing, I think. But of course, Whitman sent Emerson the first edition of Leaves of Grass, and then Emerson sent him back a letter praising it and saying how great it was. And then,
Mhm.
without Emerson's consent, Whitman put that, he basically created the idea of the blurb with this. I think I might get some of this wrong,
Huh.
but I think the second edition of Leaves of Grass, he put a blurb, a little excerpt from Emerson's letter on the back of that, and
Huh.
Emerson didn't even know he was going to do that. He also basically created the author photo with that image of him in the front of the book, the
Oh,
famous
yeah.
image of. Well, you know, I have a final question, and this is going to be kind of looping back to when I first started this podcast. I guess that was maybe, I don't know, no, 5 or 6 years ago. And when I first started it, I basically started it to kind of ask people about like unusual experiences that they had, because I just love to talk to people about that sort of thing. And so, yeah, at first it was mainly centered around asking people about, you know, whether mystical or non-ordinary or paranormal or psychedelic or whatever experiences that were, you know, just unusual. So, yeah, that's where I wanted to kind of like land this conversation. I wanted to ask you, if you could share any experience from childhood or adolescence or adulthood, that, you know, kind of was either very unusual or paradigm shifting on some level.
Yeah. Yeah. I've been blessed to have any number of, um, yeah, transformative experiences. There's always quite a number of them that are, tender and extremely personal.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the one that I think of right now that um, will give a sense of, the general vibe of a lot of my transformative experiences in life, but
Okay.
is a little more social than some of the others, is um, big reveal. I was into jam bands as a high schooler. I'm still a deadhead,
Nice.
very much so at age 40. But in high school and college, I'd go to all these festivals, and I'd go see Fish, I'd go see Mo. And we went to Bonnaroo, the first Bonnaroo,
Nice.
this festival in Tennessee with some friends, I guess 2002. It's night. This is a very festive atmosphere. It's been raining and the rain has passed. There's lights everywhere. I'm walking down this dirt path to the concert venues. There's people everywhere. Everybody's tripping, including me. And this girl walking towards me, she steps into basically a sinkhole in the mud and rips her leg out, gets it out, and has lost her sandal way, way down in the mud. And without really thinking about anything, and I'm in this beautiful nighttime just atmosphere. Um, I get down flat on the ground on my chest, muddy and all, reach my entire arm down into the earth where her leg went, fish around in the ground, like head looking up like this, all these strangers.
Yeah,
And I find her sandal
that's
and I
amazing.
pull it out from the crust of the earth and I give her her sandal. And that's one of the happiest moments of my life. And I think that is the first time that I had I heard Clark Coolidge read from the crystal text last night,
Awesome.
and one of the things about crystals is that they really are the thing down deepest in the earth that we
Mm,
get to, you know,
hmm.
that's part of their charge, is that they are the deepest down things in the crust that we get to hold. And I thought of this thing that I'm telling you about now last night, because I was really down in there.
Hmm.
I was in the soul, like the mud, the low stuff,
Yeah.
and it was I think a union of those two feelings. It's like, this is an intensely spiritual experience,
Yeah.
and with my entire right arm, stuck in the earth. So I'll leave it at
That's
that.
incredible. I love that.
It always makes me smile to think of that.